Imagine if in Central Europe, if in countries like Holland and Germany and Austria, you had all of these laws against objectivism, laws against incitement to objectivism, Randian objectivism. And people go into schools when they're young and they're taught about the evils of objectivism and how objectivism took over the world and drove the whole world into misery and exploitation and all sorts of indignities, all sorts of unfairnesses in the workplace and being sent to fight in capitalist wars and with factories that were pseudo death camps and all this stuff about the horrors of an objectivist society. And yet, despite all of this propaganda, despite this control, despite the laws and the fact that everyone's professed social norms are to be against objectivism. Despite all of this, there are still wells of objectivist thinking here and there. Underground, here and there, you have objectivist groups. And you have liberal-minded people who, perhaps when they get drunk or in unguarded moments, will say something objectivist here and there. Will say something about the immorality or the irrationality of altruism and how one ought to manifest eudaimonia or something like that. That would be very weird. That would be a very strange situation. Why there has to be this massive propaganda complex and legal complex to stamp out objectivism, and yet objectivism still won't go away. How strange. But of course that is precisely what is happening with racial identity in these countries. You have this massive propaganda complex. You have people being told what is the correct thing to think. And yet, despite all this, it won't go away. The racial identity will not go away. What you have happening is a conflict between two very primitive, very base drives. And let's not, and that's something that people need to recognize, is that it's conformism on the one hand and my tribe, right or wrong, on the other hand. It's the tendency towards conformity, towards group values on the one hand, and the tendency towards tribal loyalty on the other. Right? Intellectualism doesn't come into it except in a after the fact sense. So, because from an evolutionary standpoint, it makes sense to embrace the values of the tribe. And this can be seen in Christian atheists. These are people who are usually, quote-unquote, conservative by their political persuasion, who recognize that God obviously doesn't exist. Where is God? Show me the evidence. There is no evidence except little anecdotes from desert scribblings, right? And they recognize that God doesn't exist, but they still go to church, they still support the church, they still like it, they all kind of go and humor the pastor, and, maybe the pastor actually does have an intelligent thing to say here and there. He is human after all. And that's what they do. But they don't shit all over the church or Christianity. Why? Well, because that's their ethno-religion. Right? That's their group, and that's the beliefs of their group. And they're not going to shit all over the beliefs of their group, even though they're wrong, because the correctness of the beliefs is kind of secondary, really, right? And kind of unimportant in terms of Christianity. Whether God exists or not is not really an important thing. It doesn't really affect much. Now, if you take it super, super seriously, it may begin to affect things, and it may begin to actually shape policy here and there. But on abortion, for example, it may shape policy. But as the rise of the quote-unquote progressive Christians has shown, it doesn't necessarily mean much in terms of economic policy. So, but there was an article, and this is a very old article by some doofus. And this doofus, I think some people have seen it. Maybe I'm hoping someone in the comment section will point out who this person is. Wrote 2 articles in Huffington Post. Well, he wrote multiple articles, but 2 of the articles that he wrote were, one was about Israel needing to preserve its Jewish nature, its Jewish identity. That was one article. And the other article was about white nationalism, the scourge that won't go away. Now, you'd think someone who is that monumentally hypocritical would be a bit more nuanced about it, but apparently not. But his point, white nationalism, the scourge, well, if you want to view it as a scourge, then okay, that won't go away. Well, you're right, it won't go away. For the same reason that nepotism won't go away. For the same reason that the objectification of women won't go away. Because it's natural. It's a naturalness. Right? And even in liberal-minded people, you give them the implicit association test, they still show biases. And they still show biases even though I have no way of knowing for sure if this is the case, but in my opinion, when they take those implicit association tests, the liberal-minded people try to game it a little bit in order to get the no-bias scores. Right? They try to game it. That's what I think they do. Because I've been able to do that. I was able to game the test and show no bias in my scores if I wanted to. Now, when I actually did it honestly, I actually got average bias, right? Which was, well, that actually tells me something else about how prevalent, how actually normal I am in my predispositions. Not in my actual expressed views. Obviously, I'm quite abnormal on that front. But in terms of my predisposition, I'm probably quite normal. Anyway. So, the scourge that won't go away. Well, it won't go away. Right? Because it's always there. Something like objectivism, Randian objectivism, or something like Marxism. That is something that requires an active effort in order to push. You have to teach people Marxism, whatever your conception of that may be. You have to teach people, heck, you have to teach people Islam or Christianity. You have to teach them this. It doesn't exist naturally. It doesn't exist without some sort of activity on the part of someone in order to push it. Without this active support, it withers away. Marxism or objectivism, for example, if nobody supported it, it would wither away. It did not exist. One piece of evidence is that objectivism did not exist prior to Ayn Rand. Right? However, racial identity did exist prior to what? What is the primary pushers of racial identity? I don't even know. Now I know the demons ascribed to racial identity. One is Hitler, right, and the other is the. I guess maybe in some countries colonialism is a big deal, and then in the United States you have slavery and the Confederacy. But of course, what people are forgetting is that the racial policy of the United States, for example, 38 of the, I believe, 48 states in the U.S. at the time had anti-race mixing laws, and those who didn't, well, it just really wasn't an issue because they didn't have people of multiple races. California, for example, had laws against the mixing of not only blacks and whites, but whites and mestizos and whites and Japanese and Chinese. And this was the country that defeated Nazi Germany. Right? And What was the great, you know, active campaign in order to push for these laws? There was none. In the rise of the Bolsheviks in Russia, it required an active campaign. Now, to be fair, there was, as Lenin called it, the raw, undifferentiated material of revolution. Right? There was some general animosity, but it had to be directed, it had to be molded by a vanguard in the form of the Bolsheviks. It did not come about spontaneously. It did not come about naturally. Whereas if you look at the history of anti-miscegenation laws in the 13 colonies, and then the Confederation, and then the United States, if you look at that, what you see is that these laws, these norms, came about almost spontaneously. There was no right. At first, and you could say, for example, with anti-sodomy laws or anti-adultery laws, well, that existed in the Bible, fine. But anti-race mixing laws, did that exist in the Bible? So with those, now, in my opinion, anti-adultery laws and anti-sodomy laws are something natural. That it's not necessarily a biblical thing. Now, there are degrees to which it can be, socially acceptable or not acceptable. Certainly, you can find biblical passages that can amplify an already existing, social bias, which may be rather minor, but then they take the religion to codify it into an absolute group norm, right? And so you then latch onto this sort of the biological propensity of people to conform to group norms, which then amplifies. They might already think, yeah, I think butt sex is kind of gross and should be discouraged. But then you get this biblical passage, right, that says this is the group norm, that butt sex is awful, and then it drives into a real hatred of homosexuals beyond what is natural. That's what I think happens. Anyway, that there is a natural disdain for homosexuals, which is then ridiculously amplified by it becoming a group norm. And that's the same way I view race mixing. Right? There is a natural disdain towards race mixing, one that is amplified by it becoming a group norm. So, but in my opinion, I don't know this to be sure. Now, the problem though is that we have a group norm that says that if you oppose race mixing, you're the devil, right? So in order to oppose race mixing, well, you're opposing the core values of the group that you're in, right? You're opposing, first off, you're opposing, quote unquote, the anti-racist trope. You're also opposing the freedom of the individual trope to breed with who they want. I mean, the results of arranged marriages, we know that arranged and chosen marriages succeed at about the same rate. So the idea that if people choose their mate, that they'll be happier, I mean, that's not true. Okay? So the idea that, oh, well, you're limiting their choice. Well, okay, I guess it is, you're limiting their freedom. Okay, but my freedom. That's another topic that deserves its whole video and its whole consideration in and of itself. What did I want to say with this video? What I wanted to say in this video is that racial identity is not something that goes away. It doesn't go away. It'll only go away when you begin to manipulate the genome and make it go away at that level. But it's not going to go away by social conditioning. It can be suppressed by social conditioning. But that's what it will be. It will be always suppressed. Always suppressed. It will never go away. And if the forces of suppression weaken or simply get tired of suppressing, right? You have multiple generations of people who have been, suppressing racism, and then they look around and say, "What racism?" and then it comes back, and then the forces of suppression have just been basically, just being in charge for too long. If you have a regime that's in charge for too long, they begin to own all the failures, and there's a backlash, right? So, and well, I'll just leave it there.